The phone felt heavy in my hand, a lead weight against my ear. My sister Sarah was on the other end, her voice a tremor of grief I refused to let in. "He's gone, Clara. Dad passed away this morning." A cool, sterile quiet filled my apartment in downtown New York. I looked out the window at the endless, indifferent rush of traffic, the blare of a horn, the shimmer of 1,000 reflections on glass and steel. "And?" I asked, my voice flat, emotionless. There was a long pause, a breath of disbelief. "And, Clara, it's his funeral on Friday. I know you're busy, but I'm not going." I cut her off, the words crisp and final. Why would I? It's a pointless goodbye for someone who wasted his life. The silence on Sarah's end was a new kind of silence, heavy and full of judgment. It was the silence I'd cultivated over years, the one that proved I was nothing like him, the man who had nothing but debt and empty promises to his name. My father. My whole life, he'd been a ghost, a presence that never truly showed up. He was the reason I clawed my way out of our small-town life in Ohio, the reason I worked myself into the ground to build a life of my own, free from his mistakes. "He was still our father," she whispered, her tone a mix of pleading and accusation. "A father does more than just give you a last name." I shot back, the familiar bitterness rising in my throat. "He was an anchor, Sarah. He kept us all from moving forward." I broke free. "You just decided to sink with him." I could almost see her flinching on the other end. She was still there, in that same house, in that same small town, surrounded by the ghosts of his failures. I had a corner office, a designer wardrobe, and a bank account that made me feel safe. He had none of it. I had built this empire as a monument to his downfall, a constant reminder of everything he wasn't. Going back would be admitting defeat. It would be a surrender to the past I'd fought so hard to escape. I hung up before she could say another word. The click of the phone a final, emphatic period. The rain started outside, a cold, miserable drizzle that mirrored nothing inside of me. I felt no sorrow, no regret, just a stark, hollow satisfaction. And for a moment, I believed it was enough. If you are enjoying this story, please make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. The next few days were a blur of work and deliberate distraction. I buried myself in spreadsheets and client presentations, the fluorescent glow of my office a shield against the world outside. The city's hum was my comfort, the predictable rhythm of success a soothing balm for a soul that should have been in turmoil. But there was no turmoil, just an empty space where emotions should have been. On Thursday, I was in a meeting, detailing quarterly projections, when my phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. I ignored it, then another, and another. My colleagues looked at me, a silent expectation in their eyes. I excused myself, my face a mask of polite professionalism, and walked to the empty break room. The messages were a series of photos. The first was of a yellowed, faded picture of my father, looking impossibly young, holding a tiny, smiling me on his shoulders. The second was of him sitting on our porch swing, a guitar in his lap. The third of him teaching a young Sarah how to fish by a muddy creek. A sharp, unexpected pang hit me in the gut. Not grief, but annoyance. How dare she? How dare she try to sentimentalize a man who was so thoroughly disappointing? I felt the familiar rage simmer beneath my polished exterior. He wasn't a hero. He was a man who worked dead-end jobs, who promised us Christmas gifts he couldn't afford, who let the house fall into disrepair while he sat on the porch and stared into space. That man in the photos was a carefully curated lie. My reflection stared back at me in the dark glass of the break room window. A woman in a tailored suit, a sharp bob, and a face that was a testament to ambition. I was my own father's ghost, haunting my own life with his failures, even as I pretended to be free. The image of his smile from that photograph, so genuine and full of light, flickered in my mind's eye. It was a fleeting, uncomfortable moment of humanity, quickly suppressed. I couldn't afford to feel. Not for him. Not for anyone. I deleted the messages. It was a clean, final act, just like hanging up the phone. I returned to my meeting, my mind a fortress once more, and for a few hours the ghost in the glass was gone. The day of the funeral, I woke up to an oppressively gray sky, the kind of weather that felt tailor-made for sorrow. I was scheduled for a high-stakes presentation, and the day was planned down to the minute. My phone buzzed. It was Sarah again. "The funeral is starting now, Clara. Are you sure you won't change your mind? Please. I silenced the phone and threw it on the bed. A surge of irritation, hot and familiar, washed over me. She just didn't get it. She didn't understand the freedom I had worked for, the liberation from the past I had sacrificed everything to achieve. Going to the funeral would be like admitting that I was still tied to that life, that his death had any power over me. It didn't, or so I told myself. I put on my power suit, the expensive fabric a second skin, and tied my hair back into a severe bun. This was my armor. The city was my battlefield, and I was winning. I took a taxi to the office, the usual noise of the city unable to drown out the quiet in my own head. My father's face, the one from the old photo, kept surfacing, a younger version of him, with laugh lines around his eyes that I never remembered seeing. During the presentation, my mind kept drifting. I was talking about Q4 projections, but I was seeing the chipped paint on our old porch swing, the tangled fishing line on the floor of his rusty truck. My voice, usually so steady and commanding, faltered for a moment. My boss, Mr. Harrison, noticed. "Everything all right, Clara?" he asked, his tone laced with concern. "Perfectly fine," I said, a little too quickly. I forced myself to focus, to push the images out. I finished the presentation with a renewed, almost desperate focus, every word a nail in the coffin of my past. But as I walked back to my office, I felt an unfamiliar sensation, a hollowness that wasn't just a lack of emotion, but a vacuum, a void where my heart should have been. The city hummed around me, but for the first time, it didn't feel like home. It felt like an escape, a very lonely escape. Days turned into a week into 2. The messages from Sarah stopped. The silence from her was louder than any of her pleas. I tried to convince myself that this was a victory, that she had finally accepted my decision. But instead of peace, I felt an unsettling unease. Then, a package arrived at my apartment. It was a small, dusty cardboard box, taped clumsily. The return address was a scrawled handwriting I recognized with a jolt. My father's. A wave of nausea hit me. I put the box down on my kitchen island, circling it like a predator. What was in it? A letter? His last will and testament? A pathetic attempt to tug at my heartstrings from beyond the grave. I stared at it for hours. The city outside my window was a kaleidoscope of light and noise, a world so far removed from the small-town life that box represented. I should throw it away, just like I threw away the memory of him. But something held me back. Curiosity, perhaps, or a sick fascination. That night, I opened it. Inside, wrapped in a faded handkerchief, was a small hand-carved wooden bird. I remembered it. He'd spent months on it, whittling away in the garage. He had told me it was a falcon, strong and free, and that it was for me, a gift to help me fly away someday. He'd wanted me to leave. I pushed the memory away. Beneath the bird was a small stack of old photos. Not the perfect curated ones Sarah had sent, but candid shots. Him and me, both of us much younger, looking at a caterpillar on a leaf, laughing. Him helping me build a bookshelf that was hopelessly lopsided. Him giving me a piggyback ride. My legs wrapped around his waist, my head nestled against his back. A small envelope was tucked at the very bottom. Inside was a single, crumpled letter, addressed to me. To my strongest girl, Clara. I felt my hand shake as I held it. My vision blurred. I couldn't read it. Not yet. The weight of that small, unopened envelope was heavier than any of my professional victories. It was a truth I had spent my entire life running from. And in that moment, in the solitude of my impeccably decorated apartment, I was finally trapped. If you're finding this story compelling, remember to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the dramatic conclusion of Clara's journey. The letter sat on my nightstand for 3 days, a constant, silent accusation. I couldn't bring myself to open it. The world outside my apartment felt normal, but inside, I was crumbling. The image of the wooden falcon and the candid photos had become a constant presence in my mind. I couldn't focus at work. I snapped at my colleagues. My polished exterior was cracking. On the 3rd night, after a miserable day of pretending everything was fine, I finally picked up the letter. The paper was thin and worn. I unfolded it slowly, the scent of old paper and something else, a faint, lingering smell of wood and dust, hitting me. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. My dearest Clara, if you are reading this, I'm gone. I know you've spent your life trying to get away from me, and I don't blame you. I was not a great father. I was a failure. I was so caught up in my own disappointments, in the things I couldn't have, that I didn't see the one thing I did have. You, your strength, your fire, your stubbornness. I carved that falcon for you because I always saw it in you, that desire to fly. I wanted you to go far, far away from all my mistakes. But I also wanted you to know I was proud of you, so proud of the woman you became. I just wish I had found a way to tell you that when I was still here. Please, my little falcon, don't let my memory be a cage. It was never my intention. And tell Sarah I love her more than words can say. She was the one who kept me from falling completely. All my love, Dad. The words were a physical blow. Not the cold, heartless man I had created in my mind, but a man riddled with regrets, a man who saw my ambition as something to be proud of, not an act of rebellion. The anger, the bitterness, the carefully constructed narrative of my life, it all evaporated in an instant. I wasn't running from a villain. I was running from a man who was already broken, a man who had wanted me to be happy, to be free. The truth was far more painful than any lie. The letter changed everything. My life, my victories, my carefully built success, they all felt hollow now. I had defined myself by the absence of my father, and now that absence was filled with a painful, undeniable truth. I wasn't an independent success story. I was a girl who had spent her entire life running from a man who loved her, a man who had already surrendered. I couldn't work. The spreadsheets were meaningless, the presentations a farce. The city, which had once felt like my sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage. I saw him everywhere, in the tired eyes of a bus driver, in the worn hands of a street vendor, in the small, hopeful smiles of fathers with their children. I was haunted not by his failures, but by my own. I had missed his funeral, not out of strength, but out of a cowardice so profound it took my breath away. I was afraid to face the truth, afraid to see the man I had turned my back on. I finally called Sarah. My hand was shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. She answered on the second ring, her voice wary. "Hello? It's me, Clara." My voice cracked on her name, a long, weary sigh. "What do you want?" I got the box. I read the letter. The line was quiet for a long time. I could hear a muffled sob on her end. "He knew you wouldn't come," she said, her voice a raw whisper. "He gave me that box a week before he gave me that letter and told me to send it to you if you didn't come. He said you'd be too busy, too important. He told me it was okay." The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. He had accepted my rejection, excused my cruelty. I was the monster, not him. The reflection I saw in the mirror now was a stranger, a cold, hard, unfeeling woman who had convinced herself that cruelty was strength. I packed a small bag. The decision was not logical, not something I had to think about. It was a raw, primal need. I had to go home. I had to face the consequences of my choices, to stand in the place where I had fled from, and to apologize. I called my office and took an indefinite leave of absence. My boss was concerned, but I didn't care. Nothing mattered anymore except this. The drive was long, the miles a physical representation of the distance I had put between myself and my family. The sleek modern buildings of New York gave way to the rolling hills and quiet towns of the Midwest. The sky turned from a sterile gray to a vast, open blue, dotted with cotton-like clouds. The air smelled different here, of fresh-cut grass and rain-soaked earth. I arrived at the old house at dusk. It looked smaller than I remembered, the paint peeling, the porch swing empty. A wave of sadness, deep and crushing, finally broke through my carefully constructed walls. This wasn't just a house of failures. It was a home, a place of memories I had deliberately buried. Sarah was sitting on the porch, a mug of tea in her hands. She looked tired, her face etched with a grief I knew I had a hand in. When she saw me get out of the car, her expression hardened. "What are you doing here, Clara?" she asked, her voice devoid of any warmth. I had no words, no perfect rehearsed apology. "I'm sorry," I said, the words a hoarse whisper. "I'm so sorry, Sarah." She just stared at me, her eyes a mirror of my own failures. I had skipped a funeral, not out of strength, but out of a profound and terrifying weakness. I had convinced myself that I was a hero, But in the end, I was the one who had wasted my life, not him. The life I had built was a monument of bitterness, a hollow victory, and I was finally home to face the emptiness I had created. If you are feeling invested in Clara's journey, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to see what happens in the final chapters. The next few days were a blur of quiet tension. Sarah let me stay, but she didn't offer comfort. She spoke in clipped sentences, her eyes avoiding mine. The house was a museum of my past. I saw the pencil marks on the doorframe, measuring our height as we grew. I found a box of old VHS tapes with labels in my father's handwriting. Clara's first steps, Sarah's first recital. I realized that he had been there all along, a quiet presence documenting our lives, even when I had convinced myself he was absent. One afternoon, I was in the garage, the familiar scent of sawdust and oil filling the air. The workbench was just as I remembered it, a chaotic mess of tools and half-finished projects. I saw it then, tucked away behind a stack of old magazines, a half-carved bird, almost identical to the one he had sent me. It was smaller, less detailed, the wood still rough. I picked it up, the splinters in the wood a testament to his effort. Sarah came into the garage, her hands in her pockets. "He was making that one for Noah," she said, her voice soft. "My son. He was going to give it to him for his birthday." A single tear rolled down her cheek. He ran out of time. I stood there, holding the half-finished bird, the full weight of my actions crashing down on me. He wasn't just a man who had failed. He was a man who had never stopped trying. He had wanted to be a part of my life, a part of my sister's, a part of his grandson's. And I had denied him that, denied him my presence, even in death. I had to apologize not just to Sarah, but to the memory of the man I had so willfully misunderstood. "He wanted to be a grandfather," I whispered, my voice choked with emotion. "He was," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears. "Noah loved him. Dad was the one who taught him how to ride a bike, how to skip rocks on the lake. He was there for him, Clara. He was there for me. You were the only one who left." The final blow to my carefully constructed ego came when Sarah showed me the family photo album. It was a massive, leather-bound book filled with a lifetime of memories. I had thought my father's life was a complete waste, but I was wrong. I saw pictures of him at a local community center, helping to build a playground. I saw photos of him coaching a Little League baseball team, his face beaming with pride. I saw him with his friends, laughing, their faces creased with joy. "He was a good man, Clara," Sarah said, her voice gentle, as if speaking to a child. "He just wasn't good with money. He was always giving what he had to others. He was a pillar of this community. He couldn't see his own worth." The man I had turned my back on wasn't a failure in the eyes of everyone. He was a kind, generous soul who had given his life to others. My bitter narrative was a lie, a shield I had built to justify my own selfishness. That night, I went to his grave. The air was cool and crisp, the moonlight casting long shadows on the headstones. I stood there for a long time, the words, "I'm sorry," finally leaving my lips. They were a pathetic offering, a whispered confession to a man who couldn't hear them, but it was a start. I wasn't just apologizing for skipping his funeral. I was apologizing for a lifetime of judgment, for a heart I had so cruelly hardened. I finally understood that true strength wasn't about running away from the past, but about having the courage to face it. My heart was no longer an empty void. It was filled with a familiar ache, the ache of grief and regret, but it was also filled with something else, a fragile but undeniable hope. Hope that I could finally be a sister again, a person who was not defined by her bitterness, and maybe, just maybe, a woman who could learn to forgive, starting with herself. The next morning, I went to Sarah. She was in the kitchen, making breakfast for Noah. The scent of pancakes filled the air. She didn't look at me, but I didn't need her to. "I'm not going back to New York," I said, my voice steady. "Not yet. I want to help you. With everything. The house, the bills, whatever you need. And I want to get to know my nephew. Please." Sarah turned around, her eyes wide with surprise. A small smile, the first one I had seen since I arrived, touched her lips. "He'd like that," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "He'd really like that, Clara." I looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes. And I knew that this was where my journey truly began. Not in a corner office in a towering building, but here, in a small, imperfect house, in a town I had once so desperately wanted to escape. My life had been a meticulously planned climb to the top, but I had reached the summit only to find that I was utterly alone. True fulfillment was not in the accumulation of wealth or power, but in the simple, messy reality of connection, of family, and of learning to be truly human. I knelt down and looked at my nephew, Noah, a small boy with the same kind eyes my father had. He was a legacy of kindness, a testament to a life lived with love, not with ambition. My father's final gift to me wasn't the wooden bird or the letter. It was the opportunity to finally stop running and find my way home. And this time I knew I would stay. Thank you for watching this emotional journey. If this story resonated with you, please consider subscribing to the channel to support more stories like this one.